everyone, welcome back to The Unfiltered. So today I have a guest that I'm super excited to bring onto this channel, and that is Audrey from TouchDNA Lab. She has an amazing channel, and basically what she does is she breaks down forensic DNA in plain language for lawyers, courts, and for all of us in the true crime community. Now, her special focus is on trace or touch DNA and how a fragile lab result can turn into a very confident story in a court of law. So I don't want to keep anybody waiting. Let's introduce Audrey.
Yes, thank you for having me, Wendy. Yes, I am in hospital billing and compliance during the day, and then by night, I'm an independent forensic document reviewer.
I'm really excited to have you on my channel. I've been watching your videos and following what you've done, given that the TouchDNA was basically the crown jewel of this case. You know, this is basically all they had. And so I've been watching your analysis and your breakdown of just how fragile that trace DNA is. So it would be great for you to explain a little bit about it, just in normal people language. What is TouchDNA and why is it so tricky?
So the main thing with trace DNA is that it's different. It is not like blood, sweat, semen, or saliva. Those types of DNA have a lot of genetic information in them. So usually in the lab, they behave like they're a robust profile, and they do run fairly smoothly within the lab tech's tests. Now with trace DNA, it travels, and so a lot of times the arguments in court are over the mechanism of travel. The state's argument usually is it's direct contact, and the defendant was there during crime time. The defense usually goes with the position that this is secondary transfer, and that doesn't necessarily place the defendant at the scene because trace DNA doesn't really have a timestamp. And I don't know if you remember that statistic that was all over the news, that 5.37 octillion number, which they said was a match. That's not necessarily.
I do remember that, and that is a huge number to put as a potential match to this trace DNA. There's a number like that, like let's say 1 in 1 trillion still come from a borderline sample.
So that number is called the likelihood ratio. It's a very narrow question about identity. It doesn't necessarily identify someone. It's what the lab is asking. Is the defendant the source of this profile rather than another unrelated person? And so they put a probability statistic on it, and that's what you get. But what you're not getting is all the things underneath, because with trace DNA, not only is there the likelihood ratio, but you need to account for the TPPR, which is transfer, persistence, relevance, and recovery. Transfer is the mechanism of transfer, whether that's secondary or direct, secondary, or tertiary. Persistence is how long does that stay on the surface. Relevance, how common is it to be on this type of service? And recovery is, when the lab recovers or swabs and they extract the DNA. And then we have the activity level, which is the how and the when of the DNA, because trace DNA doesn't necessarily have a timestamp. So you want to be able to have linking evidence that might have a timestamp on it to give you a better idea if it was direct transfer, or did it happen before? Did it happen after? Was it some type of contamination while it was in police custody or in the lab? And then you also have thresholds, which is the analytical thresholds with the lab techs in the lab. There's a line where if the DNA sample is so fragile, they don't feel comfortable in interpreting it under that particular threshold. And so, but the problem with that is each lab kind of fluctuates their thresholds. They put them where they would like them. And it sounds like with this Q1.1 profile from the sheath, that they were right there at that analytical line because it failed standards the first step after extraction, which means their system, their quality control system, said, no, this isn't good enough. And it failed their own quality check. And then in another instance, go ahead.
Yes, I recall that that they couldn't match. Yeah, they couldn't match that information. I do recall that.
And there was also another failure. Their internal lane standard failed, and that's the ruler they use to measure the peak. And the peak are the alleles, and what they're doing is they're trying to figure out which loci, what location these peaks are, so they can make that STR, the short tandem repeat. But the problem is their quality control said no, more than once, because that's how low template DNA behaves in the lab. It doesn't, you need to really troubleshoot it. And it did look like they were having some difficulty getting usable data out of that extract. Now, when we hear the 5.37 octillion on the news, we don't get to hear that part of the story. So no matter if it was a big blood stain or the trace DNA sample, they're going to give the same likelihood ratio. But it's perched on top of all of these different things that actually show this was a difficult profile to work with.
Yes, I recall that it was. Are you saying this was difficult from the very beginning when the Idaho State Police Lab originally extracted that profile before transporting it?
Yes, and I want to make a distinction here because I know that a lot of people use Ortham to kind of legitimize what happened in the ISP lab, but they're two different labs. And so ISP, they are going to call a profile. They're going to call alleles regardless of what's there. And when you have some autonomy with these lab techs. So when they're looking at the allele pairs, there could be a stray allele in there. There could be a real allele that dropped out. So if you're missing a few of those, it might not do anything. But if you're missing just enough of those, whatever profile that lab calls may not be an accurate representation of the profile that was actually found on the sheath. I'm not exactly saying what they found is wrong. I'm just saying these are caution. This is precaution that we should take when we are dealing with trace DNA in a case, because whatever happened to that extract in that lab, if there was anything that went on or any issues, Ortham is downstream, so they're going to inherit all of those issues or troubleshooting. And when Ortham says, oh yeah, we had a ton of DNA, that just means whatever they did in the ISP lab, they pushed the system to get it to a point where Ortham was able to say, yeah, we have enough here to do IgG in our workflow.
Also leading into the chain of custody from transportation from the Moscow, Idaho police lab to Osram, because we know that they delivered the sample after they did the original test. So my question is, how reliable was the storage of that sample? How reliable was the transportation of that sample?
Now, I'll tell you, I am not exactly sure about that. But from what I hear, sometimes police departments do travel with samples, and it does matter how that was packaged and how that was dealt with. But I also tell you, a lot of the chain of custody in this case is not clear. And this is another one of those situations where that chain of custody is just unclear. There's very little that we know about that. But yes, we have the lab director, David Gabney, testifying that he wasn't actually in possession of the sample, but I think he traveled with the officer who was.
Yes, from what I gather, he accompanied him, and I believe they flew to Texas to Othram, and so obviously we don't know what happens to the sample when it goes through, let's say, a scanner at an airport terminal. You know, how fragile is that? Is it able to withstand the effects of going through that? I know he did accompany him like that. You know, the storage of the sample the day before it was transported and the original date that it was locked into storage, there was a little gap in locking that sample where it was originally placed into storage. Then it was left unattended, and then the next day it was booked out of storage before it was transported to Audrey. There are gaps in the chain of custody when transporting that sample.
Now, for me as a juror, I'd have a huge problem with that because I'm a documented oriented person. That's what I do. That's how I look through forensics. Like I don't work in a lab. I'm looking on all the documentation. And documentation is one of the most important things for me. And I think this is a great opportunity to just enlighten your audience that if you do get that letter in the mail that you do have to serve on a jury, these are absolutely excellent questions. And since we are in true crime, we're already there. We're already breaking down complex timelines. We're already looking up policy. We're already looking up the rules for DNA. We just need to pull that back one more. And then we'll be in an area where policymakers love to be, and all you have to do is ask about the rules. What are the rules? And if the expert on the stand is not able to give you, well, these are the typical rules and standards that we have from our standards body, because they're going to say, well, in our lab, this is acceptable. And, you know, we don't necessarily have to accept that because we can say, well, you know, the rules are this, but you didn't really package that sample very well. And there are some gaps in where the chain of custody there and when it was taken out of storage and given to Ortho. And that's another thing. That should bring our confidence in that sample down. And I know a lot of times when there is trace DNA or you do have those standard failures in the lab, in the ISP lab, they'll give you that number with confidence. But normally when you're in court, that confidence doesn't come down to match what that profile is actually saying or as far as it can support a case like a capital case. And so this is another one of those things where DNA was never meant to be the smoking gun. It was just supposed to be a supporting piece of evidence. And in this case, when you have standard failures in the lab, then you have questions about chain of custody before it gets to another lab. This is our prime examples of where caution needs to come in. And it really comes down to the question of, do you actually trust this sample? Are we really going to trust this when it has gone through all of these things that could easily compromise it? It was almost compromised at the first step after extraction. And I know it's a new idea for people to think, well, DNA might not be as strong as we originally thought it was. And that would be right. And I know this is a new way of thinking, but we're all used to that 1990s CSI effect kind of DNA education. But the issue is science has moved on and our technology has gotten better and better that it can see smaller and smaller. And so when you have that, you have to adjust for that. And then you have the likelihood proposition, the likelihood ratio that needs to be paired with the activity level. Because trace DNA can be background DNA, like ecosystem level DNA, where DNA is just present. DNA is like dust that happens to have human DNA in it. So it can be anywhere at any time. You don't even have to be in the vicinity for your DNA to go in another place. And scientists are finding that it's just natural to have human DNA. I remember reading an article about zoologists, and they were trying to pull DNA out of the air because they were trying to study different animals or see if they could see if prehistoric animals were ever in the area. And they were quoted as saying in the article, human DNA is junking up all of the areas we need to look at. They're like, it's making it difficult to pull out the animal DNA. So yeah, the natural state of trace DNA is environmental. It is in the environment. So then we have a duty to say, okay, the logic is different now. It's not, oh, your DNA was found at a crime scene, so you must have done it. That's 90s thinking. Now we have technology that pulls DNA out of the air. So we need to be approaching DNA with a different lens and with caution. And so when you have a DNA sample at Q1.1 that has an issue, first step after extraction, and then we're questioning, how was this packaged? Why are there time gaps in your chain of custody? That octillion levels statistic needs to come way down, and we need to really question, what does that
And you're
profile
right,
actually
what you say about TouchDNA, I mean, it can be anywhere. If you think of any object in your home, people touch everything. So I do agree with you on that. That was something that was a huge red flag to me, as we discussed the other nights. We don't realize how many things we touch every day, how many things you might brush against, because this was apparently from a male source, where the finger brushed against this tiny little metal sheath. Now, we don't know who handled that sheath or how many people could have touched it, like you're saying, even before it ended up at the crime scene. So that is important for people to understand how many things you touch in a day.
Right, and I often say trace DNA doesn't have a timestamp. It is dependent on the other evidence in the case. And so what that means, I know that traditionally we've tried to make an entire case fit a DNA sample because it's that same idea of the 1990s, your DNA was found at a crime scene, so you probably did it. But trace DNA is different. And so now if you have trace DNA, it's supporting. So then you have to look at the timeline of the other evidence in the case. The timelines in the rest of the case would be the vehicle and the timely advance records from the cell phone. And so if Cy-Ray is correct that the cell phone data does not show what the state says it does, and there is a missing 7 minutes that puts Brian Koberger elsewhere, and we also have video that does not have a clear picture of a license plate. We have an FBI agent who was going to testify to a body style and a year, a possible year. That is not an identification. So then you have a person like Cy-Ray saying there isn't a timestamp that is accurate for the state. The timestamps vary. And so when you don't have another reliable timestamp in the case, you can't place another timestamp on the trace DNA. And so then you're getting into the activity level propositions again, where there's two main hypotheses. Hypothesis one is usually for the state. That means the defendant did the criminal activity. Hypothesis number two is usually for the defense, and that says that the defendant did an alternate activity, a legitimate innocent activity. And the way that you determine that is that you do look at all the other evidence and you see, first you gotta find where your timeline is. What are the things that have timestamps? Then after that, you can ask if it is plausible that this person was in and out with this object during these timelines, or at this time, this car was doing X and this phone was doing Y. And then you can layer in the DNA. But the DNA in this case, if Cy-Ray is correct, it doesn't support hypothesis number one. It doesn't support that Brian was there with the sheep during crime time. It supports the second hypothesis that it was secondary transfer, that the defendant was doing an alternate activity, something legitimate or innocent, whereas it was transferred at some time that we don't know, and that's because there isn't another timestamp in the case to support when that DNA was deposited. I'm not sure
And
if that makes
I
sense.
do believe Sarah's theory that there were gaps in the cell data. I mean, this was my understanding how they leaned so heavily on this TouchDNA is because they were trying to line up the white elantras that that came up with the cell phone pings, and none of them matched Brian Koberger. So that was a huge, it was a huge problem for them. And this is when they started leaning on this investigative genetic genealogy and the trace DNA, which, as we see now, is not 100% accurate.
It could be, but I like to put caution on it because the initial quality control checks in the lab said no a few times before they were actually to get something readable. And, you know, I think that's important to highlight that because a blood stain is going to behave much differently in the lab. It's going to go through their runs and their checks much more easily because it's robust. It has a lot of genetic material. But, you know, I keep saying trace DNA, you know, is different. So, and it is fragile. So it deserves the kind of caution that we should give it because it really is invisible to the naked eye. We're talking about something invisible here that they have to inject a fluorescent like dye into it to be able to see some of it. And then they put that information into their software and their software calculates probabilities. And so then we're given these mathematical equations and, you know, so, I mean, they do that with blood DNA as well, but it's not as heavily modeled on software as trace DNA would be. So taking that into account, that it's dependent on software, whereas blood, sweat, semen, saliva may not be, it's usually not dependent on modeling software.
I understand that the lab was pretty frustrated with the small amounts that they actually had to work with. So maybe let me ask you, the rest of the knife sheath, the samples on that sheath, the actual blood evidence that was on the sheath, how much of that was tested? How does that compare to the trace DNA that was tested?
Well, Q1.4, well, it was Q1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. They were all on the same plate that initially failed. And I think they were also all on the same plate that it failed the internal lane standard, the ruler that measures the peaks. So they were all very fragile as well. However, those were blood stains. And I did notice in the ISP lab reports that they did test Q1.4 against one of the cigarette butts they found. And they were able to exclude whatever suspect was associated with that cigarette butt. So they were testing people against that Q1.4. So at one point, I guess they hadn't decided on which profile was going to be the probative one, the one they picked. And I guess ultimately they picked 1.1, which is also unfortunate because every standards organization, whether it's NIST, the American Academy for Forensic Science, or it's the International Standards Organization, all of them are, you test the blood first. The blood gets priority. And the Q1.2, 1.3, 1.4, those are all blood samples. And there's also unknown male B, C, and D that were found in the house. There were also some other mixtures where the victims were major, and there were unknown minor contributors that were not further tested. So they said that Q1.2 and 1.3, they said there was no further testing for those, even though they did detect male DNA in them. Q1.4 was tested a little further, but it's unclear how much further it was. And the unknown male B, C, and D, they were not tested any further. And it's very odd to have a crime scene that's blood scene where they set aside all of the blood. There's no clear explanation of why they did that. They do say generic things like, oh, can't go any further, or not enough information here. But that shouldn't be. It's very odd.
That is something that has always baffled me, why they never tested um, those samples, because we know that they have them. We know they had the samples from underneath Madison Morgan's fingernails, which were tested. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because that was very interesting to me that they found the sample belonging to, I think it was 3 males.
Yes, so that's tricky because that was a mixture, and under her fingernails, I do believe it was a mixture of several people. However, those profiles were considered inconclusive, which means they probably fell below the interpretability. They probably fell below the analytical threshold. And what that means is there's a line where they don't want to go and interpret because it gets a little bit difficult to interpret. But also what you do have below that line is you see that there are other contributors in there. And that was one of the worries that I had with Q1.1. Even though they are saying it's single source, I'm wondering if it is actually there is a low-lying mixture, because they were having issues with it in the lab, which means it was right there at the analytical threshold. And so once you get behind that line, you can see other things that are going on, and whether it's a dust particle, an artifact, or a stray allele, they can be present. And what happened was with the DNA under Maddie's fingernails, that DNA was so low, but they could still see it, but they weren't able to determine who it actually was. And that's another thing that's very misleading with these likelihood ratios, because a likelihood ratio was given to each one of those profiles. And a lot of times juries don't understand inconclusive means they can't perform the tests. That doesn't mean that person is necessarily included or excluded. It's like they can't test it. And I know a lot of jurors think, well, if you can't exclude it, it's still included. Like, no, it doesn't really work exactly like that. But they were unable to determine or identify those profiles. They could just see there were some males and females in there, and then they were doing their hypothesis. How likely is this person to be in this mixture? Now, see, there are several types of likelihood ratios because they're questions. They're not necessarily identity. They're loosely identity, very narrow. How likely is Ethan to be in this mixture? Or how likely is so-and-so to be in this mixture? And then they assign these different mixture or these different profiles that they can sort of see a probability. Now, that is very difficult because, yeah, there's clearly other male DNA under there, but they were unable to identify it. And so just imagine, this is a very good point that you bring up, because initially they had Brian in there and they labeled him as inconclusive. However, the defense said, I want to be able to independently test that. So they were able to independently retest it. They were able to, but however, it failed the replication. They were unable to do what the state had originally done with it. And so I don't know if you remember, but Westrig, he's a DNA expert. He wrote a pretty long motion about how he looked at the DNA, he looked at the different standards, and he ultimately came to the conclusion that he agrees with the defense that Brian Koberger was excluded from that particular mixture. Now, my question is, I understand that was under Maddie's fingernails. Those were all low template DNA profiles. They were so low they couldn't read all of the information there. And I'm wondering if they were able to actually retest Q1.1, would it fail replicate testing like 13.1 did? Because it sounds like this was a low template DNA profile. And if in fact it did have independent testing, which I don't believe that it did, because they had the extract with the actual sample of the sheath was consumed. They don't have anymore. And if it was retested, what kind of results would we get? Would it be another scenario where even though it went from Brian is included, would it have gone to inconclusive, or would he have been excluded altogether? And this is where you get where there's a blurry line with this barely is the sample interpretable, and then we're running into issues, like that, and repeat testings, and yeah.
How reliable is this DNA when it's retested and retested in that way as well?
That's a great question, because you do lose genetic material every time you're testing it. But in the life cycle of Q1.1, they had an extract, and then they kept pushing that extract because they didn't have any more genetic material. So they just had the extract part of it. And so you're running into more things where caution needs to come in, because if they no longer have the biological sample, they can't really run new tests. And especially in a case like this, or any high profile case, you're supposed to preserve those things for anything in the future, or for appeals. You're not necessarily supposed to just consume all of it. And the state is supposed to try to save a little bit so the defense can do some independent testing. But in this case, it doesn't sound like that was able to be done. And it's a shame that TouchDNA that needs this level of caution was used to anchor a capital case.
Yes, especially a capital case. And so that would make me ask you, what would people at home, jurors, ask themselves before they accept that DNA could be a match, and say that this equals that Brian Koberger actually committed this crime?
So keep in mind that they are going to put a likelihood ratio on a blood stain and a trace DNA sample. And they're going to be the same no matter what the history of that sample is. So in the case of trace DNA, it is much different. That's when the caution comes in. Did that sample or extract fail standards in their lab? Were there chain of custody issues? And keep in mind that the likelihood ratio, that number, that octillion statistic that they say, it's likely it's a match octillion times over, or whatever they put on it, keep in mind that is only a likelihood ratio. That only asks who, the source. But with trace DNA, we also need to know the how and the when of the DNA. Did the defendant do the criminal activity, or did the defendant do the alternate activity? And make sure that, the thresholds. Do you actually trust this sample? Does it sound like it's a robust sample? Is it going to be able to support what the state is asking you for it to support? And that I understand that this is very different thinking. I came to thinking about this, and, it shocked me a little to learn, wait a minute, this DNA is different. So it's just a matter of, we've moved past the 1990s DNA education now. So hopefully, I know that a lot of true crime, the community, they really love learning about DNA, and I'm so surprised and happy that people are interested in it, and they're really open to thinking about DNA in a new way. And that's the key. We just need to think about DNA in a new way, have some new conversations about it, and it's actually quite fun, in my opinion.
To me too, I was very surprised when I realized how small this amount actually was, and just being touched. Because as we spoke the other night, it was said that Brian was wearing gloves during this crime, but that also defies how the DNA would have ended up on the knife sheath. So that was something that I feel kind of baffled me, is, okay, did he touch the knife sheath before? Who touched it? many people could have touched this knife sheath, but did it happen during the crime? Certainly, if he had gloves on, I don't think it would have been possible to have touched it during the time that the crime happened. If that makes any sense, what I'm saying to you is when, like you saying before, as you mentioned before, when was this transfer onto the knife sheath? We don't know, because if they're saying that he had gloves on during the time that this crime was committed, then we know that it wasn't touched during the time of the crime itself.
You bring up an excellent point, because the nature of trace DNA is it travels. Whoever was wearing gloves, they could have traced DNA from somebody else on the outside of those gloves. So no matter if there is touching, and that was another thing. Another thing I would want to express to juries and attorneys, and it also answers this question here, is the term trace or the term touch DNA is a misnomer because it assumes direct transfer. It assumes that the defendant touched a key piece of evidence. And so we're finding, especially trace DNA, you don't necessarily have to touch something for your trace DNA to be on there. So being aware of that there may not have been a touch event, that may not have been the mechanism of travel or the mechanism of transfer. It could have been, there could have been an intermediary, somebody else. There could have been a person between Brian, a person, and then that person touched the sheath. And they have the handshaking example where if you shake someone's hand and then you end up touching something else, you're going to have that other person's DNA on your own hands. And so you're right. Wearing gloves may or may not decrease the likelihood of DNA transferring to an object, but you also are running into that issue where you could have somebody else's trace DNA on the outside of those gloves. And that is so likely.
I mean, how are you going to remove the gloves if you are at a crime scene? And this is something I think about a lot. You're not going to, there's several ways to remove a glove when you're touching it, right? You could pull them off with your hands, or you're going to roll them typically from the bottom and turn them inside out. So how much DNA would you leave just by removing the gloves during a crime like this? Because I would imagine it doesn't matter what kind of glove you're wearing, that you're going to leave a tremendous amount of DNA in those gloves. And then when you're on your way out, also touching everything.
Absolutely. You would expect at a blood scene like this, the perpetrator would have also spilled blood as well. The nature of these injuries, what we've seen in the crime scene photos of the little bit that we could see. And so the story of that there's just this one pristine trace DNA profile doesn't quite fit. No. That doesn't really go that logically and forensically. Those are inconsistent with standard forensic standards.
I think this was something I brought up in one of the very first videos I did, is that whoever committed this crime would have been severely injured, right? Think about that. We've often seen them talk about the selfies, and we can do this in another video though, but I just want to bring it up. And, they talk about that cut he had on his finger. Now, if you imagine him going into his home by himself, he would have been injured. That's my opinion, that somebody doing that to four very, very active, very fit students who were, as we know now, not sleeping, to my mind, he would be injured. We were told that they fought back. So what would he be wearing not to be injured? If that makes any sense, what I'm saying is you would have some injuries.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Or in my opinion, a lot of injuries from committing a crime like that?
I want to answer it like this because I think that you've hit a key thing in the state's theory. And I think Ann Taylor's experts touched on it too. Now, at the very beginning, in the probable cause affidavit, the words amido black are in there. And I don't know if your viewers know what that is. I'm sure most of us know what luminol is. It's very similar to luminol, but it's a different type of test that does pull up proteins. It's supposed to pull up harder to see protein that you can't see with the naked eye. And it's called amido black.
Correct. They used a lot of the amido black in the kitchen area.
And that is not the only place we've seen it. Yeah, so we saw it in the probable cause. Ann Taylor said that one of her experts determined that there might have been a cleanup. And then it was in one of Hitler's orders where he also said, I think it was in a footnote, that the state was going to have a DNA expert explain why they didn't test the full mattresses, and that they did use amido black in some areas. Now, that word amido black is a red flag for me because that means there was some cleaning done here. Because you don't throw that around. In a blood scene like this, you should be able to use luminol because it should be very apparent what happened here with all the bodily fluids that should be at a scene the way that they were describing it. And so there are places in the
anybody watching this, maybe you should explain to them a little bit, if you don't mind. What is the difference between testing with amido black and luminol?
So luminol, you can spray right there, and you shine a light on it, and it will illuminate like fluorescent. And that's also working with the proteins. But amido black, from my understanding, is that you can see things if they've been cleaned, things that you cannot see with the naked eye. I look at it as like a stronger test. It will pull up things. Actually, Miss Potts, I don't know if you watch her, if your audience knows who she is.
She's very good.
She has a great video that explains exactly how amido black works. There are a few more steps in it because it is a more invasive type of testing.
Okay. I think, yeah, we can definitely ask people to go and have a look at her channel, and she can explain. I have watched a lot of her videos. She does some great work as well. So I mean, I did notice they tested with amido black. Oh, so go back to what you were saying. Sorry about that.
That's a great question, and please slow me down anytime because I'll just go off, and then you need to bring me back down and say, "Hold on, can you explain that a little more?" So please keep doing that. In my opinion,
I'd like to hear it. I think it is very important for people to understand how this investigation was carried out, and even the defense attorney asking questions like that. When you talk about a cleanup, I did do a video on that, and it was my feel. If you look at the amount of testing that was done in that kitchen area, that there was definite evidence of a cleanup. I've always felt that way. So, and you can see the testing that they used, if you bring it up on those countertops and around the sliding door in different areas. But it is interesting that you also bring that up.
Yeah, it's very strange, especially if it's supposed to be a quad homicide in a blood scene. You would expect there to be a little bit. It's lots of blood. I want to say that there is lots of blood. That I would expect to see different patterns of aerial spray. I'm not a blood expert. I strictly am very focused on trace DNA only. But just from my general everyday, personal opinion, I would expect to see different patterns in that house. and you see a few drops on the floor, maybe on a door jamb or actually a door, you do see a lot in the floor of Xana's and Ethan's room. And you do see a lot on the comforters in Maddie and Kaylee's room. And of course, we haven't seen all the photos, so there could be more, I don't know, but the pattern, the bloods,
there is a lot of pushback not to release any more photos. So that also makes it very impossible for us to see the extent of the blood patterns. But I mean, we did see it in the beginning of the case when they described it, and there were pictures of not only inside the house but outside the house. If you remember those pictures, they were pretty graphic.
Yeah, and the forensic team, well, I don't even know if it was the forensic team. Somebody came up and removed the mattresses and put them in the back of pickup trucks. That blew me away. That is not proper protocol.
Trying to send out. You know, when you do something like that, you are sending a message out to people. There's nothing more to see here. We've wrapped up everything, even though it's not. And it's almost like tricking the public to say, well, we've wrapped up everything. There's nothing to see. Nobody's going to look into this any further. Case closed. It's like a very big deception in my mind when I see them doing things like that.
Yeah, I agree. And that's another one of these things, the case doesn't fit. It just doesn't. Yeah.
It almost feels too neat. And then, yes, we did speak about this guilty plea. This is a question that I see coming up a lot. So if I comment on any video, or you look at comments on anybody who is covering this case, not those of us that are on the side of this investigation was not handled in the correct way, but on other channels, people will come back, and I see this a lot, and they'll say, but Brian pled guilty. Now, I think this is something that I want to ask you about. Why do you think, I'll weigh in on it as well, why would somebody feel pushed towards a guilty plea when, especially in this case, when the science is so overwhelming?
Yes, and of course I don't know for sure, but I have tried to answer this question before, and my answer always is, this is about human existence. This isn't really about what the defense could have presented. This is not about, that there could have been at least one juror who would have, at least thought he was innocent. I want to roll that back because we did see some of Brian Kohberger's papers and the crime scene photos that they released of his apartment. And he wrote several papers, and I think he analyzed a book. I can't remember what it is, but he was describing dynamics within a jury. And he was describing that some of these jurors were overtaken by emotion, and they were letting that emotion get in the way of objective looking at the evidence. And there was one guy in there that was saying, look, I want to objectively look at this evidence. This evidence isn't saying that. And then you had a dynamic of the larger portion of the jury kind of almost ganging up on this person, telling him that he was terrible, look at the victims and their families. How can you not think this person is guilty? And I haven't read that book, but I'm not sure if the book made it seem like this guy was being unreasonably cold to everybody, that he happened to be the villain. But Brian, he astutely pointed out, no, this person remained objective, whereas the other jurors, they've already decided the case emotionally. And I can only imagine Brian, he wasn't there to study crime scenes. He was there to study the psychology within criminal justice. So he was very well aware of how not only the system works, but how the psychology between people works within the system. And I do feel that there are certain personality types who are that emotional based personality where, and it would be hard for me even, that whoever was sitting in that jury, they would see the autopsies of the students. They would see the contrast of when they were laughing on video and you see them being lively and just fun young women. And then you would see their autopsy photos. That is so jarring. I can't imagine how traumatic that would be anybody in the jury to see that. And I know for me personally, I think there would have been at least one person that was say, internally, they might not have even been aware of it. It doesn't matter who's sitting in that chair. Somebody is going to be responsible for this. And so, yes, I think at most there could have been a hung jury. However, you also, I think you need to take in consideration that I do believe that we were in a generated environment for a very long time with this case. And I do think that, with all the leaks with the state, that there was some type of PR firm that was hired. And a lot of times when you have these PR terms, you can get an extended social media packet where you have either bots or human hybrid bots to kind of, I call it gardening social media, where if there are independent voices, they kind of tune them back to the narrative that they want. And they do use this particular setup and this psychology within political circles on X and then on different things where they do have this divide, because it's a lot like bot farms where they want engagement, but they also want to rein in that narrative. So then you have the bots online, and then you have the mainstream media, and they're reinforcing what these bots are doing. And so we were kind of surrounded, and I call it the generated 360 because anybody who had an independent voice was shamed. So then you have a public that is primed, because who would ever not just believe the state and just say what they're saying is true? So if you didn't have any other information, I could clearly see why people would be like, wow, this person is guilty. But what they don't understand is that that narrative was generated and it was put onto the public. So not only do you have general dynamics of what can occur in that jury room, but you also have a public that's primed to say that you're guilty even before they come into court. And so this is a man who, he deeply understood these dynamics. I think this is bigger than just, oh, well, gosh, all the evidence here points to his innocence.
I agree with you, and especially with media, and I'm not going to name any specific channels. I think everybody who watches my channel knows my trigger points on that. But they even admitted to changing images of Brian Koberger. Now, I mean, this is not hard to see. So you'll see on some videos where you have your people that have already predetermined his guilt even before he entered a court of law. And they will make him look worse in the image than what he looks. So they'll doctor the image. And I think people can see where I'm going with this. So they swayed the public's opinion long before. I mean, I remember in the beginning watching this case when Brian was taken in, and all the images released of him and the headlines were stacked against him. He wasn't a suspect. He was already guilty. The minute they took him in, he was guilty. And I think he knows that. He knew that the public's perception of him is that he's some kind of monster. And they've always compared him to a serial killer, which is crazy because there's no evidence of that. And I think Brian almost understood that the odds are against him if he enters that courtroom. So when people ask me why I think he took a guilty plea, I try and put that in their mind and say, what was he going to do? It's that public perception of him that is already swayed from day one, entering that courtroom knowing it doesn't matter what evidence you put there, he is going to face a lot of backlash from people who, before they've even entered the courtroom, I mean, I'm across the country, so I remember when they requested this change of venue because they wanted an impartial jury, and this is impossible because the whole world knows about this case. So it's not even possible to get an impartial jury, given that I'm talking to you from across the world, and I know that it's, you can't go in and say, okay, people don't know about this case.
So I think that you're right. This is like the world watching this case. And so what they hope to find is it's okay if somebody knows about it. They just want them to be kind of neutral about it. And even that's going to be difficult. It's kind of like everybody's mostly heard about the Super Bowl, but does everybody care about it? So they want to find jurors that are kind of in that situation there. Decisions are made when you're actually in a high tension moment, when factors like that are happening. The public, and there's jurors, and there's autopsy photos are coming, and this room is being created for you to die in.
It frightens anybody. I think the idea of that would frighten anybody, and that's going to take me to where I think, possibly on my perspective, is that his mother might have also spoken to him about it, because I know that she was very anti this. So maybe during the conversations, she even, I don't know, I don't know this for a fact, but just given on what I've seen, his close relationship with his parents, is he might have thought, well, this is a better alternative. Plead guilty and still spare my parents that agony of knowing I'm going to be put in front of a firing squad. And also buy some time for more evidence to come out, more documents to be released.
That is a very real possibility that his mother would do that. And I also think a lot of the people who are saying, oh, I would scream from the rooftops, or I would keep fighting, we're also running on programming from the 90s as well, where there really weren't algorithms, there weren't AI bots. And so we're in a completely different ecosystem now. And so it becomes a question whether, does the defendant even have a chance with these AI-generated algorithms, with these AI-generated news stories? Are there companies that are researching different types of words and phrases, knowing the public will gravitate towards that and adopt certain ideas? And so a lot of times these AIs, they've already written the end of the story, and then they feed it to the public. And so by the time the public does get in the courtroom, they already know the end of the story, because these studies have been done, and they are running all of these algorithms, and they're just outputting all of this information into the public, and the public is absorbing it. It becomes absolutely impossible for a defendant to defend themselves in this kind of environment. And this is one of the first cases, if not the first, that we're seeing that the algorithm has definitely amplified every aspect of this case.
You can see which side of the case the algorithm is on. This is very obvious when you look at your big channels covering the case, those that are the guilters, and those of us that are seeking the truth. The algorithm is definitely favoring their channels, even though they're not putting out all the information, and this is baffling. Even when I saw your channel for the first time, I thought, how does this channel not have thousands and thousands and thousands of subscribers? But I realized that it is a problem with the algorithm, and that is scary. That should scare anybody.
You bring up a great point that algorithms, they work in a different way. They work by engagement. So that might not be truth. That's just what people are clicking on.
Could be. Yeah, no, I did notice that with the algorithm to some degree, and I was wondering about it because, there's some great content creators out there that we've both spoken about, other channels that you've collaborated with, others that I've watched that I think are really great, and
yeah,
they're
not
just
getting the
not getting.
attention. Yep.
Yeah, they're not. They're not
There's
getting.
truth out there, but the algorithm doesn't like it.
It's very, very strange. And I know we have so much that we're still going to discuss in the future.
Yes, I would love to do part 2, and maybe I can have you over on my channel. This has been such a great conversation. I'm having lots of fun.
Love that. I really appreciate your inputs. I hope that everybody is on, on the same path now and goes and watches all your videos and analyzes them, see where we are with this case, with the testing and everything. So I really appreciate you coming on to my channel and giving your insight. It means a lot to me.
Thanks for having me, Wendy. I appreciate it.